distinction.
Gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you. I've read something here for the first time, and I agree with it. I've thought it, but and it's from Mr. Johnson, who actually was called by the Democratic majority to testify. But what he says is that short-term measures taken by the U.S. government since the fall of 2008, particularly under the Obama administration, have helped stabilize financial markets, primarily by providing unprecedented levels of direct and indirect support to the large banks. But these same measures have not removed the long-run causes of systemic instability. In fact, as a result of supporting these leading institutions on generous terms, systemic risk has likely been exacerbated. In other words, the bailouts have actually increased the danger. Now, Mr. Wallison, that's similar to, you have said that in a different way, have you not? That we're actually creating a more dangerous environment.
Yes, of course. Every time we bail out one institution, we create the belief on the part of people in the markets that other institutions of a similar size or maybe even smaller will also be bailed out. Right. And as a result, great risk, moral hazard is created, as Professor Mahoney made so clear in his testimony.
Right. Mr. Kanjorski and I, we were at a meeting of one of the leading hedge funds managers. I won't name his name, but Financial Times said he was the smartest billionaire in the world. And he said the same thing you said about Lehman in your testimony. The problem was that the markets were shocked. They thought that they were going to bail them out because they'd bailed out Lehman, which is exactly what you said. I'm not sure if you were aware. You know, this gentleman's a private, very private individual, but y'all have come to the same conclusion. Now, Mr. Johnson goes on to say, and I believe this is absolutely true, some of our largest financial firms have actually become bigger relative to the system and stronger politically as a result of the crisis. The competition's been eliminated. And you agree with that, Mr. Johnson?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay. Executives of the surviving large firms have every reason to believe they are too big to fail. They have no incentive to help bring system risk down to acceptable level. That's exactly the problem we have today. Now, Mr. Johnson goes on to say that when you have a situation like this, it's either bailout or collapse, but as it begins to affect other institutions, responsible official thinking shifts to bailout at any cost. And we certainly have seen that over the past 6 months. Mr. Zandi says, and here's where I think we maybe can all come to a consensus. He said the Treasury and Fed were seemingly confused as to whether they had the authority or ability to intervene to forestall a Lehman bankruptcy and ensure an orderly resolution of the broker-dealer's failure. Well, they didn't have the procedure wasn't in place. Now, Mr. Mahoney today has said give them that procedure. As I understand it, give them a procedure, but in bankruptcy. Is that right, Mr. Mahoney?
That's right. I think the idea of adding another chapter to the bankruptcy code makes perfect sense. It is probably the case that the amount of agenda control that debtors have in the standard Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceeding could be disruptive in the case of a large financial institution where you're dealing with some short-term creditors who need to know what's the value of this obligation that I'm holding sooner rather than later. And so I think you could create a quicker, more streamlined procedure. But I would draw a sharp distinction between the procedure through which this happens and the substantive rules that will govern it, because I think it is important that the substantive rules be the same as they would be for anyone else, which is to say The creditors take their losses in the order of their contractual priority, so it is predictable. There's a set of rules that is known in advance, and everyone will understand where they are in the pecking order.
And Mr. Zanity, I'll close by saying that you said the confusion is the big problem. But if we had the substantive rules that we used in Drexel, WorldCom, you know, Lehman, you know, ultimately, you would clear up the confusion, you'd have certainty, and the certainty would be that they would go into, you would have an expedited procedure, and you can call that expedited bankruptcy, but it really needs to be that, in my opinion.
I think the bankruptcy code probably would be inadequate for purposes of these kinds of failures.
But if we made if we changed the procedure of
I don't think the courts would be viable for the kinds of decision-making that needs to be done as quickly as needs to be done.
Well, you know, we had a small bank in Washington fail, and the FDIC put 400 people on it. So obviously they would need help of the regulators. I mean, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I just, you know, to me, too big to fail is more than the interconnectedness of the institutions. It also goes to the collective confidence we have in our system. You get bank runs, and if you go into a bankruptcy proceeding, you may be able to solve the interconnectedness problems, but confidence would still be an issue.
Of course, you know, you said about the regulators, you said we all know they had a complete lack of understanding. So,
yeah, and it needs to be changed, but I don't think the bankruptcy code is.
But I don't know how you give understanding. You know, I think that you know, that's actually worse than the bankruptcy courts to me. If you gave them the procedure, you gave them a right to do things, and you established a procedure, and maybe we'd work together on some things, how we could amend that code and use the basics of it.
The gentleman from New York now